Hello gamers, my name is Duma and welcome to the Game Room. Part of what we provide here on the channel are simple modified builds for gamers who need a little extra help. Whatever in life may have you moving a little bit slower or in need of a combination, we have you covered here at the Game Room with builds that are easy to play but pack a big punch. I recently published the 2-button Arcanist, and after seeing your feedback of just how much there is a need for this type of modified builds for players, I immediately began working on the next build in the series, also a class you requested, which brings us today with the 3-button Necromancer. This build also has the option to use no light attacks, no heavy attacks, and no ultimate use at all. Just 3 total buttons if you want. It absolutely flew through Veteran Vateshran, as you can see here, in a trifecta Spirit Slayer run in 35 minutes with no deaths or sigil use. It was able to very easily solo my 12-man trial boss test, St. Lothus in Asylum Sanctorium, in a faster time than the recent 1-bar Immortal Nightblade build. And just to show you how I'm not exaggerating even a little bit and there's no clickbait, I did use light attacks in those fights that you just saw. However, I told you it'd be optional to not use them if you need a little extra accommodation. And here is every single boss from a full Veteran Maelstrom Arena clear, of which there are no light attacks, no heavy attacks, or ultimate use in any fight for the whole run. And just as an added bonus, because you know we're a bit extra around here, with a few very small changes and a bit of light weaving, if that's something you wanted to get into, this setup can also parse around the lower 80,000 DPS with tons of wiggle room to improve that DPS, including an entirely open back bar if that's an interest for you. This one is special, and I think some of you who are Necro mains are really going to enjoy this one. There isn't anything you can't do easily in PvE with this setup. You can solo any content in the game that's meant to be soloed on any difficulty, all of your daily running around and overworld stuff, do dungeons including veteran and hard modes, and plenty of introductory and even medium tier trials are completely viable if you got into the DPS side of the build. This build will definitely open doors for players who are looking for modified builds to help elevate their gameplay. The written guide is up for you now over at thegameroom.tv, along with tons of other ESO builds and guides if that's something that you need. Okay, let's take a look. You can make most races work for this build. A Magicka based race is better, with a high elf being the best. We have all 64 points in Magicka and using the Clockwork Citrus Fillet food or the cheaper version of Witch Mother's Potent Brew. For maximum DPS, where health isn't a concern at all, you can also use Ghastly Eyeballs. For solo content, we have the Lover Mundus. For group content, the Thief Mundus. If you're really struggling with sustain, you can also use the Atronach Mundus. And our potion will be Tripods. Before we go over gear, I want to show you a bit behind the scenes so you understand where some of the passive defensive strength is coming from. One of the things we're doing is taking a page from our 2-button Arcanist playbook and stacking health recovery in places that won't affect our damage much. To show you some of the big items, we have our base health recovery, minor fortitude from Oakensoul, major fortitude from Tripods, our food, the Necro Undead Confederate passive when Spirit Guardian is up, the rejuvenation CP, and the big one, the CP slottable strategic reserve. This gives you scaling health recovery for how much ultimate you have, and at max ultimate, you gain a ton of recovery. Altogether, this brings us to a wild health recovery of 3732, but let's look at the value without Spirit Guardian at 3434, as Spirit Guardian is more of an emergency button, not something you'll have up passively normally. For reference of how strong this is every 2 seconds. So let's divide this by 2 to get our per second average, and we get about 1717 health recovery per second. Now let's look at the Restoration Staff skill line and the popular PvE healing ability, Radiating Regen, using the stat values this build has. If we take this value at 16,428 and divide it by 10 to get our rough per second estimate, we get about 1642 health per second. You legitimately turn your character into its own pocket healer without even pressing a button, all happening passively. For our gear, we're doing a trick with the Overwhelming Surge set, where we use it on the weapon, shoulder, and jewelry pieces, which will allow us to use a medium set on the body, which normally isn't sustainable or can be very difficult to do so on a full mag setup. Depending on the setup, this can do different things for us, like take advantage of extra medium armor passives or give us access to additional armor rating for solo content. This is possible because the Surge set shoots lightning from your body to nearby enemies, dealing damage and returning a percentage of that damage as Magicka, allowing you to backdoor your sustain in a way that normally isn't possible to this degree, or you'd have to make some other accommodations to do so. We pair that with the second AoE proc set that most of you probably already have or have heard of, Pillar of Nirn. You may recognize this combo from our recent solo DK guide as well. This is an incredibly potent combo for solo content, giving you tons of both AoE and single target damage in the form of lightning, physical, and bleed damage, which also procs its associated status effects. These two are also going to work in synergy with our ability kit, where we will be bringing additional strong AoE abilities to the table, allowing you to mow down waves of enemies in most any content. content. We pair those sets together with Oakensoul, a lightning staff, and all that's topped off with a one-piece slime crawl helm. Here's your gear config for enchants, weights, and traits. A quick note here, if you end up loving this build, it may be a good idea for you to farm a backup jewelry set so you can trait them in Bloodthirsty if you were interested in the higher end DPS version as well, just for that extra bit of min-max. But for solo content and most dungeon stuff, Arcane is totally fine on the jewelry, and Infused is fine for Oakensoul if it's already set up that way. This is also up on the written guide for you over on the website, so I'm going to move on here and let you pause the video and whatnot if needed. For our abilities, first we have a passive ability of Either Morph of Flare. This is slotted only for the passive benefit of major protection, reducing the damage you take by 10%. If you don't need this damage mitigation, or if you don't have Flare, you can just slot Inner Light here from the Mages Guild for more passive damage and healing. We are not using a defensive set like Hexos, however, so I would consider its use for difficult solo content. Next is Spirit Guardian. This is an ability you don't use, but is here if you need it. This will shut everything down for you when things are rough. It adds another 10% damage reduction while it's active and heals you for its duration. As you can see here, it's very hard to die just from health recovery in the build and Ghost alone. Imagine when you actually press the buttons. Think of it like an emergency panic button that's available for you if you need it, that will last up to 16 seconds for you rather than just a one-time use burst heal. That's also not accounted for as part of the everyday use of the build, just an extra panic button for you. It can also be used for things where an actual heal or shield is required if you don't have the expeditions, such as this section here in Veteran Vateshran. With Ghost, you can just run through without having to manually heal or shield yourself along the way. So very useful to have it on your bars. Your main spammable, Hungry Scythe. This does solid AoE damage in front of you, heals you, and gives you a heal over time. A perfect spammable for this kit. And the extra heal over time is what allows us to not use a defensive set like Hexos, which was originally on the build with the Stam Scythe. But this ended up being much more damage output while maintaining a solid defensive stance as well. A very important note on the build here. Any instance where I was ever pressured was instantly solved just by spamming this more. This is your lifeline. Every press is not just damage, but a burst heal for you. So by spamming it, you are both doing damage to get rid of the problem in front of you and spamming yourself with burst heals. So when in trouble, don't fall back, keep on the gas. A note here for a more single target oriented spammable with a bit more DPS is Ricochet Skulls. This is a great spammable for bosses, but you do lose Scythe's healing. So consider Spirit Guardian use here as needed. Next is Unnerving Boneyard. This is a really solid frost AoE damage source that also applies major breach to everything inside, reducing resistances. This is going to be useful in everything that you do. Next is Blighted Blastbones. This summons a skeleton that charges at enemies and explodes on top of them. So there's our little hat trick of abilities. I thought it was pretty cool as well thematically for the Necro. We have the iconic Scythe, the Graveyard, and the Skeletons. So you get that constant Necro immersion while playing as well, if that's something that's important to you. How it works is you drop your Boneyard on top of what you're fighting, then your rotation is Blast Bones, followed by 2 Scythes, and repeat forever. It doesn't change. Blast Bones, 2 Scythes. Blast Bone, 2 Scythes. That's it. Just repeat that over and over and over and redrop your Graveyard as fights shift around. Boneyard does have a component where it does 30% more damage on top of a corpse, but this isn't something you need to manage. It just happens on its own in the flow of combat. The AoE damage this dishes out is extremely solid. It's just constant huge sources of AoE damage to everything in front of you. Dungeon groups are going to love you for it with how fast a kit like this makes things move along, as well as it being perfect for solo content for yourself. There's no real ramp up, just instant full speed AoE clearing right away. For our ultimate, remember, we don't use our ultimate ever. We just sit on it for the health recovery from the strategic reserve CP. You just let it sit here. But if you slot this specific ultimate, Ravenous Goliath, you gain 2% more healing from the health avarice passive. Then you get a literally monstrous get out of jail card and reset panic button that adds 30,000 health to you and floods you with heals while being up near enemies. I never came even close to needing to use it, but it's there for you if you do need it and a great passive option for you. Regarding light attacks, look, you don't have to at all, but I really encourage you just to throw some out, even if it's random, erratic, and just whenever you happen to remember it. It's going to proc your Flame Enchant, which can proc the burning damage over time status effect, which is extra potent on a Necromancer with the Rapid Rot passive, increasing damage over time effects by 10%. It can add quite a bit of oomph over time, just randomly throwing out light attacks here and there. Just something to consider. For the parsing setup, we shuffle some skills around with a couple of changes. Keep Barb Trap and Detonating Siphon down. We sit on Dawnbreaker from the passive extra weapon damage damage from the Fighter's Guild passive Slayer, and your rotation is Blast Bones followed by 2 Ricochet Skulls. And using the changes listed here, parsed around 82k or so, with countless ways to improve it from here to increase your DPS if you wanted to lean into that direction and pull away from the solo side of things. But even still, making 0 of these changes and just using your everyday 3-button solo setup, this still maintains somewhere in the 50s on a trial dummy to give you a ballpark with light weaving, which is plenty for all the things listed in the video. And even if you straight up do not light attack at all and just use 3 buttons, you're still in the lower 40s, which is extremely good, especially considering the insane survivability of the build, and something like almost 90% of your damage sources are also AoE based, not single target based. This is really good stuff here. Boom, it's that easy, gamers. I'll leave you with a bit of gameplay so you can see it in action. I hope this adds some value to your game time. I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, please let me know, and have a wonderful day.